The snow never fell clean in the fractured markets. It came down gray and oily, clinging to Tobias Crane's shoulders like wet ash, as he picked his way through the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving trade hub. The vendor stalls stood like broken ribs against the darkening sky, their canvas roofs torn and flapping in the bitter wind. Somewhere overhead, a damaged maintenance drone circled endlessly, its voice modules stuck on repeat, droning out corrupted safety warnings that no one heard anymore. Tobias pulled his thermal scarf higher over his nose and kept walking. His boots, patched 3 times, now crunched through ice-crusted puddles that reflected the sickly neon glow of the few remaining operational signs. He wasn't here to trade. No one really traded anymore, not legitimately. The fractured markets had become a place for desperate salvage and darker transactions, the kind that happened in shadows between people who'd stopped asking questions years ago. He'd been a data archivist once, back when the colonial administration still pretended this settlement had a future. 22 years logging population records, resource allocations, birth certificates, and death reports. Then the mining operations collapsed, the corporate sponsors pulled out, and the administrative complex where he'd worked was converted into subsidized housing for the thousands who couldn't afford to leave. Tobias lived there now, in a narrow unit on the 8th floor that leaked heat through every seal. He came down to the markets twice a week, searching for expired ration packs or salvageable tech he could trade for meal credits. He had a route, sectors C through E, never further. The deeper sectors were controlled by people who'd shed whatever civilization they'd once possessed. But tonight, something pulled him off course. Maybe it was the cold, sharper than usual, making him seek shelter. Maybe it was the way the wind had died suddenly, leaving an eerie stillness that made him want to move, to fill the silence with purpose. Whatever it was, Tobias found himself walking past the boundary of Sector E and into F. Then further still, into the abandoned reaches of G12. He noticed the heat signature first, a pale shimmer visible through his cracked visor display, emanating from behind a makeshift wall of plastic sheeting. Active generators. Someone was running power out here, which meant someone was selling something valuable enough to justify the energy cost. His stomach tightened with unease, but curiosity won out. Tobias approached the source, slipping between 2 rusted fence posts into what had once been an official auction house. The structure was small, maybe 20 meters across, with a low platform and twisted metal cages welded haphazardly to the floor. Most of the cages stood open, their doors hanging at broken angles, but 3 were still occupied. A man sat beside a portable heating unit at the far end of the space, his legs stretched out, one hand holding a smoking chemical coil. He wore a jacket that was far too clean for this place's synthetic fur collar, reinforced shoulders, the kind issued to militia contractors a decade ago. His face was weathered but unbothered, the face of someone who'd seen enough that nothing surprised him anymore. Tobias kept his hands visible as he approached. The universal gesture. I'm not a threat. I'm not enforcement. I'm just another survivor. The man barely glanced up. Late for shopping, he said, his voice rough from years of breathing recycled air. I'm closing soon. Just looking, Tobias replied, his voice neutral. Then look fast. This cold costs me. Tobias moved along the row of cages, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The first 2 were empty despite their closed doors recently emptied from the scattered bedding inside. The 3rd cage held a huddled form. A woman. Tobias stopped, his breath catching in his throat. She was curled on her knees, her head bowed so her long white hair fell like a curtain across her face and shoulders. Her skin was pale violet, luminescent, even in the poor light, a hybrid of some kind, human and one of the crystalline species from the outer colonies. Her wrists were bound together with oxidized clamps, the kind used on industrial cargo. Thin metallic strips, they could hardly be called clothing, were draped across her torso and hips, more for marking property than providing modesty or warmth. Her knees were bruised, mottled with purple and green. Her feet were bare. She wasn't moving, but he could see her breath, small clouds of vapor in the frigid air. A rusted metal tag hung from the cage door. Tobias leaned closer to read it, though part of him didn't want to know. Hybrid female, non-compliant, unsuitable for domestic placement. Clearance sale 400 credits, Butcher approved. His blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. You're selling her for slaughter? The words came out before he could stop them. The trader shrugged, taking another drag from his chemical coil. She didn't bond. Screamed at the first 3 buyers. Bit the 4th one hard enough to draw blood. Nobody wants to deal with that kind of attitude. But that skin tone? He gestured with the coil, leaving a trail of acrid smoke. Might fetch decent money at the processing center. Exotic colors sell well. Not much fat on her, though mostly lean muscle. Tobias felt his jaw tighten, his hands clenching in his pockets. That's legal? Depends on who you ask and where you ask it. Out here? The man gestured vaguely at the broken walls around them. Nobody asks anything. You interested or not? If not, you're wasting my heat. Tobias looked back at the woman. As if sensing his attention, she slowly raised her head. Her eyes were violet, ringed with silver that caught the light like frost. They met his without pleading, without begging, just a steady, exhausted gaze that seemed to look straight through him. Her lips, cracked and dry, parted. They sold me for meat, she whispered. Her voice was hoarse but clear, each word deliberate. Human. She paused, swallowing with visible difficulty. Hold me. Use me. Just get me out of here. Tobias felt something crack inside his chest. She wasn't asking for rescue. She was offering herself as payment, the only currency she thought she had left. He looked away, his throat tight. Through the gaps in the plastic sheeting, he could see the snow falling harder now, thick and silent. No patrols came this far out. No enforcement, no regulations, no witnesses. If he walked away, she'd be dead within hours cut apart, processed, packaged, and sold. But she wasn't asking for help. She was negotiating her survival, the only way she'd been taught. He hated everything about it. I don't want to, he started, but couldn't finish the sentence. She flinched, her eyes dropping to the cage floor. Not from fear of him, but from the weight of rejection. From the terrible calculus that she wasn't even worth exploitation. Tobias turned sharply to the trader. 300. The man raised an eyebrow. She's got both kidneys intact. Liver's clean, too. You planning to gutter her yourself? Don't pretend she's worth more to you now. 300. The trader studied him for a long moment, then laughed a dry, humorless sound. You're one of those bureaucrat types, aren't you? Used to have principles. He pulled a data stub from his jacket and waved it lazily. 350. Right now. And I wiped the transaction record. Tobias pulled out his credit chip and held it out. Done. The trader scanned it, checked the transfer, then stood and kicked the cage door open with his boot. She's yours. I don't provide transport bags for the live ones. Tobias stepped forward slowly. The woman, the person. He corrected himself, fiercely flinched again, but didn't retreat. When he extended his hand toward her, she stared at it like it might be a trap. It's cold, he said softly. You'll need your strength to walk. She moved carefully, her legs shaking as she rose. He unbuttoned his coat and slipped it off, draping it over her shoulders. She gripped it with both bound hands, her raw fingers clutching the fabric like a lifeline. The coat swallowed her small frame. She leaned into him just barely, just enough to steady herself, and he felt the warmth of her skin through his shirt. He didn't ask her name. There would be time for that later, if she wanted to give it. They left the auction house in silence, Tobias walking slowly, she beside him with bare feet and uneven steps. The coat dragged behind her in the snow dot. No one stopped them. No one watched. Just the sound of their footsteps, fading into the white and the dark. The residential tower loomed ahead through the falling snow, its silhouette dark against the amber-lit haze of the settlement's failing infrastructure. Tobias guided them through the service entrance, avoiding the main lobby, where a bored security monitor might log their arrival. The woman, still nameless, still silent, walked beside him with mechanical precision, her bare feet leaving faint prints of blood on the frost-covered floor. He didn't speak. Neither did she. The elevator was broken, had been for months, so they took the emergency stairs. By the 4th floor, her breathing had become labored, each exhale visible in the cold stairwell air. By the 6th, she stumbled, catching herself against the wall with bound hands. Tobias stopped. "We're almost there." She nodded, but didn't look at him, her white hair falling across her face like a veil. The 8th floor corridor was dim, lit by emergency strips that had been scavenged and rewired so many times they flickered in uneven patterns. Tobias pulled out his access key, an actual physical key, because the electronic locks had failed years ago, and opened the door to Unit 847. Heat met them immediately, a wave of warmth that made the woman gasp. It wasn't much, just the thermal coils running along the baseboards, but compared to the frozen world outside, it felt like stepping into an embrace. The apartment was small. One main room that served as kitchen, workspace, and living area, with a narrow alcove in the back, curtained off for sleeping. The walls were patched with insulation foam, the windows covered in multiple layers of plastic sheeting. A low table occupied the center of the space, cluttered with data slates, ration packages, and the stripped components of salvaged electronics. Blankets were piled in the corners, extra insulation against the cold that constantly tried to seep in. The woman stood just inside the threshold, dripping melted snow onto the floor. She held his coat tight around her shoulders. Her weight shifted slightly toward the door, not ready to believe this was safety. Not yet ready to let her guard down. Tobias closed the door and engaged the manual seal, the hiss of pressurization filling the silence. He stepped out of his boots, leaving them by the entrance, and moved to the small preparation station in the corner. He opened a storage container and retrieved a sealed meal pack, sliding it into the heating unit without a word. As the heater hummed to life, he turned to face her. She hadn't moved an inch. "You can sit," he said quietly. "You don't have to stand." No response. Her violet eyes tracked past him, cataloging the blankets, the heater, the sealed windows, the single exit, calculating, planning, always aware of escape routes. He opened a drawer and pulled out a multi-tool, then knelt in front of her. "Let me get those off." She tensed as he reached for her wrists, every muscle in her body going rigid, but she didn't pull away. The clamps were industrial grade, the cheap kind used in cargo shipping, brutal and efficient. He wedged the tool into the first lock mechanism and applied pressure. The clamp popped open with a sharp crack. Then the second. Her wrists stayed together for a moment, even after the metal fell away, held by habit and muscle memory. Slowly, carefully, she let her arms separate, lowering them to her sides. The skin beneath the clamps was raw, ringed with deep bruises and abraded tissue where the metal had cut into her flesh. She said nothing, just stared at her freed wrists as if they belonged to someone else. "You should eat," Tobias said, rising. The heater chimed, and he removed the meal pack, placing it on the table. Steam rose from the reconstituted vegetable mash high-calorie paste, designed for nutritional efficiency rather than taste. But it was hot and safe. The woman moved slowly, but instead of sitting at the table, she lowered herself to the floor beside it. Her eyes fixed on the food, but her hands remained motionless in her lap. "Is it drugged?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No." A long pause. She picked up the container and took a small bite, cautious and deliberate. Then another. Then she began eating faster, her body overriding her caution with desperate hunger. Tobias sat across from her on the floor, his back against the wall. He didn't eat, didn't move, just watched her carefully, noting the tension that still held her shoulders rigid, the way her eyes kept darting to the door, to the windows, to him. She hadn't accepted that the cage was gone. Not yet. After several minutes of silence, broken only by the quiet scrape of utensil against container, she looked up at him. "Why did you take me?" He considered the question carefully. "Because no one else was going to." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not an answer. I didn't want to leave you there." "Why?" She set the container down slowly, her gaze never leaving his face. "You didn't want to use me?" His jaw tightened. "No." She tilted her head, white hair sliding across her shoulder. "But I told you that you could. That doesn't make it right." Something flickered across her expression, confusion, maybe, or the beginning of curiosity. "Then why am I here?" Tobias exhaled slowly, letting his head rest back against the wall. "I don't know yet. But I wasn't going to walk away." She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes moved around the room again, methodically mapping every detail. Not with fear, no, but with calculation. Survival skills honed by necessity. "Your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as if deciding whether to give him that piece of herself. "Silene." "Tobias. People call me Tobias." She nodded once, a small acknowledgement. "Are you military?" "No." "Why?" "You knew how to open the clamps." "I worked with inventory systems for 20 years. Same lock types on cargo containers." Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, perhaps the smallest release of tension. She studied him for another long moment, then asked the question that had clearly been building since the auction house. "If I had been less pretty, would you still have taken me?" The question hit like a physical blow. Tobias didn't answer immediately, didn't try to hide behind comfortable lies. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "I don't know. Maybe not. I saw you. I listened. I made a choice. I'm not going to pretend I'm above all that." The brutal honesty seemed to affect her more than kindness would have. Her shoulders lowered slightly, the rigid defense in her posture easing by a fraction. She stood slowly, her legs still unsteady, and walked toward the back of the apartment where the sleeping alcove was curtained off. A thin pad on the floor, a heat blanket, a small shelf with a few personal items. She turned back to face him. "Can I stay here tonight?" "Yes. I won't scream. You don't have to promise that." She pulled his coat tighter around herself and stepped behind the curtain. She didn't close it completely, leaving it open a few inches, maintaining her sight line to the exit. He heard the quiet rustle of her settling onto the sleeping pad, the soft sound of her pulling the blanket over herself. Tobias remained where he was for a long time, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, watching the thermal coils glow in the darkness. Eventually, he moved to the other side of the room where he kept a spare mat, lying down and pulling a thin cover over himself. Sleep didn't come. He lay there in the dim quiet, listening to the building settle, to the wind outside, to the almost imperceptible sound of Silene's breathing from across the room. Something gnawed at him, not guilt exactly, though there was some of that. Not confusion, though he certainly felt confused. It was the awareness that she didn't understand yet. She thought she still had to be useful to survive, had to offer something in exchange for basic humanity, and he didn't know if he was strong enough to teach her otherwise. didn't know if he had enough faith left in himself, in this dying world, to show her that she could simply exist without owing anyone anything. The heater cycled through the night, a soft mechanical rhythm that eventually lulled him into fitful sleep. He woke to pale light filtering through the yellow, plastic-covered window and the smell of warm water. His muscles ached from sleeping on the floor, his neck stiff from the awkward angle against the wall. For a moment, he was disoriented, forgetting the events of the previous night. Then he saw that the apartment had been cleaned. His coat was draped carefully over the single chair. The blanket from the alcove was folded neatly. The utensils he'd left on the table were washed and stacked on the counter. Even the floor had been swept, the dust and debris gathered into a small pile near the door. Silene was in the hygiene unit, not really a room, just a curtained-off corner with a cracked composite basin connected to the building's water system. She was crouched beside it, using a heat stick he'd forgotten he owned to warm water in a basin. She wore his coat still, but it hung open now, revealing the metallic bands underneath that served as her only other covering. Her back was to him, and he could see the elegant line of her spine, the way her white hair fell past her shoulders, the subtle movement of muscle beneath violet skin as she dipped the cloth into the steaming water. She noticed him watching. Instead of covering herself or startling, she simply said, "You don't lock your doors when you sleep." "I did." "Manual override. I could have found it. Did you?" A pause. "No." He moved to the preparation station, busying himself with another meal pack to give them both something to focus on besides the strange intimacy of the moment. His hands fumbled slightly with the controls. "I cleaned everything," she said from behind him. "You let me stay, so I cleaned." "You don't have to earn your place here," he replied without turning around. "I know." Her voice was quiet. "But I don't know what else to do." The heater beeped. He removed the meal pack and set it on the table, finally turning to face her. She stood now, the coat slipping from one shoulder, water droplets catching the morning light on her collarbone. She wasn't trying to seduce him, he realized. She simply didn't know how else to exist in someone's space. She sat on the edge of the bench across from him and didn't touch the food. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes and asked the question that had clearly kept her awake. "Why haven't you touched me?" Tobias froze. Her tone wasn't angry or flirtatious, just genuinely confused, searching for understanding. He took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because I didn't bring you here for that. But that's what I offered. I didn't accept." She leaned forward slightly. "You don't want me?" "I didn't say that either." Her expression shifted frustration, breaking through the careful neutral mask she'd maintained. "Then I don't understand." Her voice didn't rise, but there was pressure underneath it. Real confusion, not manipulation. The genuine bewilderment of someone whose entire framework for understanding human interaction had been built on transactions and exploitation. Tobias sat down across from her, the table between them like a fragile boundary. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the heater hummed. And between them hung the question neither of them yet knew how to answer. What happened when someone was offered freedom, but had no idea what to do with it?